Welcome everyone. I'm Thomas Sir. I'm the CEO of Kinexum. Today's webcast is entitled Wow or Yeow, FDA Outlook for 2021 and Beyond, and is jointly organized by Kinexum, a regulatory and clinical consulting firm, and Hogan Lovells, an international law firm with a large food and drug law practice. The first Wow or Yeow webcast was presented on the day before the inauguration of President Donald Trump in January 2017, and asked the question whether the coming year promised great things, wow, or painful things, yow, with respect to FDA, principally from the standpoint of developers of new medicines. This is the fourth annual edition, coinciding with the start of a new administration under President Joe Biden and a continuing once-in-a-century pandemic. Moderator Alexander Zan Fleming is founder and executive chairman of Kinexum, a strategic advisory firm specializing in regulatory, clinical, and other translational aspects of life science product development. While at the FDA, Zan led the medical reviews that resulted in the approval of metformin, one of the most widely used drugs for diabetes in the world, as well as the first statin, insulin analog, PPAR agonist, and growth hormone for non-GH deficiency conditions. Dave Fox of Hogan Lovells is a leading authority on the regulation of prescription and OTC drugs, biologics, combination products, and controlled substances, and is a former senior lawyer at the FDA. Stephen Grossman, president of HPS Group, a health policy and public affairs company, and among other things, a former executive at Hill and Knowlton, the global public relations firm, a deputy assistant secretary for health in the Reagan administration, and one of the chief Senate negotiators of the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 and the Hatch-Waxman Act from 1984. He's a co-founder and executive director of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. He asked me to ask for people who want to support. They welcome contributions and support, and is on the board of NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Frank Sassanowski of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara is a former deputy director of the health policy staff in the commissioner's office at the FDA, and is a leading authority, among other things, on the regulation of medicines for rare diseases, and has helped secure FDA approval for hundreds of new drugs, including over 100 new molecular entities. Tim Franson of Fager Drinker was previously president of the U.S. Pharmacopeal Convention, chair of the board of directors of the Critical Path Institute, CMO of Euroncor, and VP Global Regulatory Affairs for Eli Lilly, where he was involved in more than 20 major submission reviews and approvals. A couple housekeeping points first. If you have a question along the way or at the conclusion of the presentation, please enter it in the chat box that you can open up in your web conference application. The panel will try to get around to as many as we can. Second, a recording of this webcast will be posted and a link will be distributed to all registrants of this webcast within the next several business days. Last year, we also prepared a transcript, but that will likely take a week or two as we transcribe and proof it. And finally, a commercial for our next webinar. Why is exercise geroprotective? Molecular and evolutionary perspectives, featuring Stanford geroscientist Tom Rando and Harvard evolutionary anthropologist Dan Lieberman. That'll take place on February 26th. All registrants will receive information and a link to register should you be interested. And just for fun, for those who can open up the chat box, please, if you feel like it, please introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Dan from New York City, whatever, and we'll have a chance to see who's participating in this call as well. I now turn the mic over to Dr. Zan Fleming.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And wow, what a year it has been with a few yows. And how much I have been looking forward to this great program. I'm thrilled to have my dear friends and colleagues join this panel and to keep doing this as an annual event, which is much fun. I'm also honored by the audience that has gathered. We've had over 500 registrants, and we see former senior FDA officials in the audience, as well as other old and dear friends. So it's all a great day to come together. And we've got too much to cover. We'll do our best. I wish we could do more on devices and even on foods. Plenty of going on in those centers. And we will do that. We'll come back with specialized sessions that focus on the Center for Device and Radiologic Health, and CIFSAN, our premier agency that center that regulates foods. But today we have a lot to cover, and let me just start by having David Fox do his annual year in review of major standout FDA drug approvals. David?
Thanks, Zan. I really appreciate it. So yeah, let me take you back through FDA approvals in 2020, but first a moment of personal reflection. 2020 was the year that my family and my neighbors finally took an interest in what I do for a living. And I'm just an FDA lawyer. But, hey, what do you know about remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, the cytokine storm? Is the pillow guy really onto something? And of course, when is the vaccine coming, and should I take it? So, as we know, when Pfizer and its partner announced the interim results of their phase 3 study on November 9th, greater than 90% efficacy in a trial of more than 43,000 subjects, it was obviously a signal moment in science, the validation of a highly biopotent, seemingly adaptable vaccine platform. Interestingly, to me at least, it also may have represented a signal moment in our political history when, the release of clinical trial results one day after our election polls closed could have impacted the course of national politics. And to the extent FDA had anything to do with that, I was reminded of Judge Lamberth's admonition back in 1998 in the old Washington Legal Foundation case when he said, FDA exaggerates its overall place in the universe. Well, not this time, not this time. So while we were absorbed in all things COVID, poring over the daily New England Journal like it was the sports pages, FDA and the industry turned in yet another banner year of new drug and biologic approvals. 53 new molecular entities and novel biologics, and of course, 2 so far, and counting, 2 vaccine EUAs. 53, for those who keep track, is the second highest approval total over the last 20 years. We also had, to round out the picture, more than 70 first-time generic approvals in 2020, and at least 3 new biosimilars, but still no interchangeability determinations for biosimilars. 2020 was, of course, the year that insulin and about 20 other classes of so-called legacy proteins were moved over from drug to biologic regulation for approval purposes. These products all stay in CDER, but they're now subject to different patent exclusivity and approval standards than they were previously. And they move to a system that currently has no equivalent to a 505(b)(2) hybrid approval process, leaving a swirl of legal questions for those seeking to make bio-betters. So that's a little bit of a look back, but it's certainly going to keep us busy over the next 3, 5, 10 years. Digging in a little deeper into the approval data, nearly 25% of the approvals in 2020 came in under Subpart H, accelerated approval. To me, that's a wow. 1 in 4 approvals coming in as accelerated approval for a program that operates at the outer limits of what FDA can accept for data and still provide a full approval. Compare that with 2018. That was the high water year where we had 59 approvals, but only 7% were under accelerated approval. So what's the deal here? It may have something to do with the momentum given to drugs that have breakthrough designation, which are often candidates for accelerated approval. But another interesting issue is whether accelerated approval, which is usually based on surrogate markers, is opening up to programs that use interim clinical endpoints. And so I'm not ready to reach a conclusion here yet about this trend and whether it is a trend, but clearly a significant area to watch. One area that's holding steady rather than trending up or down is orphan approvals, and credit here to our good friend Frank Sasinowski. Nearly 60% of the approvals in 2020 were for rare diseases, which is exactly the same as in 2018 and roughly the same as in 2019. So this is a recurring theme for us: rare disease populations receiving intense industry and regulatory attention, But larger disease sets, metabolic, cardiovascular disease, diseases of aging, and mental health, looking more like the true orphans of drug development. And Zan and Thomas, I know you want to say more about that later, particularly on the metabolic and diseases of aging front. Next, we had the usual boatload of approvals in oncology with 18 approvals, nearly 1 out of every 3 drugs and biologics being oncology. All of these are critical products. So I apologize if I don't hit all the right ones, but to me, the standout approval was in bladder cancer. It's a notoriously difficult target for drug development. The 2 products for GI tumors, 3 in non-small cell lung, and 3 in breast cancer. So a very strong year for attacking solid tumors. And the numbers are even more impressive when we include the array of new drug-drug and drug-biologic combination regimens approved in 2020. As we say every year, forget the usual FDA silos. It's all about the combinations. And then there are the pseudo combinations. So we added 2 more products to the growing class of antibody drug conjugates with Sarclisa and Blenrep, both for multiple myeloma. Last on oncology, a less noticed, but probably, in my view, important approval was not for a new molecular entity. It was for a 6-week dosing interval for Keytruda instead of 2 weeks and 3-week schedules. So this allowed patients to reduce how often they come to the clinic, obviously critical during a pandemic year, but it also, to me, has longer lasting implications. It shines a real light on the need for incremental innovation to improve the psychological and social well-being of cancer patients. And with all the chatter we'll talk about today about HHS and FDA appointments, let's not forget Joe and Jill Biden and their personal experiences. So on day two of the new administration, the First Lady toured a new cancer navigation center at the Whitman Walker Clinic in downtown DC. This is a facility devoted to managing the day-to-day social and psychological stress of cancer treatment. And Dr. Biden clearly announced during the tour, this administration has the backs of cancer patients. That translates not just into novel therapeutics, but new ways of administering cancer drugs with less burden and less stress on the patient and their families. So moving beyond oncology, other observations about new approvals, and this is my own random thoughts. So again, apologies if I'm leaving any standouts or personal accomplishments out of the picture. But nothing yet on Alzheimer's disease, though we did have a rather rancorous advisory committee meeting in November, where FDA's seemingly selective use of flexible data analysis finally snapped, and the advisory committee wanted no part of it. But not to be missed, FDA did approve the first radiopharmaceutical, Tauvid, for imaging the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So the march continues. Another new approval, again, not involving a new chemical entity, but very interesting, was the reemergence of fenfluramine, the maligned partner of phentermine in the 1990s off-label fen-phen weight loss cocktail. So Zogenix received approval for its Fintepla fenfluramine product for a rare form of pediatric seizures, Dravet syndrome. It's a nifty, in my view, nifty piece of drug development work in an area that we call drug repurposing, and a reminder that we need to incentivize more of this type of research. And speaking indirectly of weight loss, Rhythm Pharmaceuticals received approval for Imcivree, setmelanotide, for weight management in patients with a confirmed genetic disorder linked to obesity. And it's worth a close look, especially for those of you who are students of companion diagnostics. In this instance, the agency did not require an FDA-approved or cleared companion test as a condition of approval. Very interesting. Another slight detour, 2020 was the year that HHS, not FDA, announced that FDA lacked the authority to regulate laboratory-developed diagnostic tests after 25 plus years of debate on how these tests should be regulated. And that was a stunner, maybe a Yeow. For some of us, we never ever like to see FDA being forced to concede jurisdiction. But then the administration in its final hours seemed to walk things partway back, saying that HHS, but not FDA, would maintain authority over lab tests, or that Mexico would pay for the tests or something. I lost track. A few more quick notes. The approval of Aimmune's Palforzia for peanut allergy way back in January 2020, and boy, that seems like a long time ago. We sometimes forget that CBER also regulates allergenic products, a particularly eclectic area of drug development that appears to be gaining significant interest. At least that's what I'm seeing. It's also a reminder, and this is a topic we discussed during last year's program, that bulking up CBER's resources in 2021 and beyond is absolutely critical. So to round out the tour, we have the EUA in May, and then the full approval in October of Gilead's Veklury, that's remdesivir. According to a press report just yesterday, sales of remdesivir will approach $3 billion for 2020. Another reminder of the scale of the epic public health crisis that we're experiencing. We also saw 2 approvals in 2020 for Ebola virus infection and an expanded approval for Xofluza for post-exposure prevention of flu. So step aside drug-resistant bacteria. This was the year of the virus, for sure. Last, I have to note, if you look on the inside page of CDER's annual drug approvals report, you'll see the usual summary from the center director, and this time it's authored by Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni, sometimes referred to as not Janet Woodcock. And that's clearly not fair to either of them. Both are stellar regulators, and Patrizia has already made her considerable mark on the center. But it may be that this will be the last time we've seen Janet Woodcock in a role as CDER Center Director, and that deserves a wow. And with that, I want to thank you and turn it back to Zan, Thomas as moderators, and I think Steve may be coming up behind me. So thank you very much.
Well, David, that summary is a wow. My gosh, we could just stay on the topics that you have provided and spend more than the time we have allotted. But what a superb discussion of 2020. And we'll come back to some of these topics in a moment. But let's go to Stephen Grossman, who clearly brings the big picture view and can talk about the dynamics both within and above FDA. So Stephen, give us your thoughts.
Well, thank you. I think it's worth mentioning that we did this last year about 2 weeks before the pandemic became a thing. And so we're all at a little peril in predicting what the year will look like. What we can say for sure is 2020 was a difficult year for FDA. It was stretched to the limits and beyond by the pandemic. There were multiple attempts, some sadly successful, to encroach upon scientific expertise and decision-making. And as referenced by David, and the agency also had an unsupportive secretary, which is pretty unusual. He picked on the LTDs. I was probably most upset by the decision right at the end to take away, to cede to USDA FDA's jurisdiction over genetically engineered animals. I concur with David. I don't like to see FDA's jurisdiction lessened, but also to have the Secretary of HHS be the person sending it over to another agency was particularly difficult. And if it's not an area you're involved in, it may be hard to understand what an incredible stab in the back that was for the agency. But it's part of 2020. It's part of the history that needs to be understood. My brief remarks will relook at 2020 and then describe some of the ways I think 2021 should be different for FDA, and I think almost entirely for the better. FDA's 2020 difficulties have been ascribed to a war on science, or quite often as a focused attack on the expertise and authority of the FDA. And I would argue it was no such thing. FDA's difficulties were the culmination of a 4-year war on expertise. That is, the problem started much earlier and elsewhere, and FDA became collateral damage and was not itself the target. Not to say there wasn't great harm done, but that wasn't the purpose. The war on expertise started in 2017 with attack on the intelligence services and the hollowing out of the State Department. It extended to the military, to EPA, to the National Weather Service, and every other aspect of government expertise. Thanks in part to Commissioner Gottlieb's adroitness and the relative lack of White House interest in public health, that war on expertise really didn't come to FDA or the public health service agencies until the pandemic drew everybody and everything into the limelight. So I think, as I say, it hurt FDA, but it wasn't aimed at FDA. It was really part of a bigger thing. In particular, I think it's worth saying that Commissioner Hahn arrived at what was possibly the worst possible time, having very little time to establish his leadership before the onslaught of directives and second guessing from above. He did well, in my opinion, against forces that had 3 years of experience in undercutting the expertise of far more powerful institutions than FDA. FDA is a hard case to undercut, but if you've done in the State Department, the intelligence services, and DOD, it's not quite so big in terms of its influence. So that's 2020. President Biden brings a completely different approach. He has a long history of listening and relying on expert opinion. The war on expertise is definitely over. He also has an interest in medicine and public health that precedes and goes far beyond the pandemic. He's also working from what could be described as the best and brightest model, and which is absolutely the antithesis of the war on expertise. Now, there are problems with the best and brightest model, but from FDA's point of view, it's a world's better to be in that model where expertise is respected. I can't predict whether FDA will come into conflict with the White House, but I can say with some assurance that any challenges will be reasoned ones, not willful or peremptory. That is to say, we may lose, we may win, but it will be on a basis that we can at least recognize as something that's worth discussion. This is definitely a White House that isn't going to directly undercut the science agencies, whether it's the asking the CDC to rewrite the mortality and morbidity weekly report, which in some ways is a greater horror than anything that was done to FDA, or whether it's telling FDA what products it should have on the market. This is not that FDA, not that White House, and that's no longer the challenge it was. There may well be issues about FDA, its authority, and its independence, but they will not be on the same basis as they were last year. Secretary Becerra, going down the line of authority towards FDA, he also is going to bring a different approach to his predecessor. He and I haven't talked about these things, but just looking at his history, it's impossible to imagine him ceding away FDA authority over and against the wishes of the agency. It's just not the way the man operates. He's a legislator, he's a lawyer, he has been an attorney general. His interests, he has no particular expertise in public health. He's closely identified with the ACA, with Medicare, Medicaid, and health financing issues. He's likely to be very focused in a way no secretary has been in a long time on family support issues that are predominant in HHS in other parts outside the public health service that get very little attention usually. There is a potential for him to take on FDA. I can't say there isn't, but at this point I can only foresee two issues that I can say in advance seem likely to me to be ones that he's going to be concerned about. The first is opioids, and the second is clinical trial diversity. In particular, on the latter, I think you can assume that he's going to cheer on the efforts of industry and FDA to work that through, but that he will prove very impatient if he's handed a 10-year timeline and not something with a great deal more immediacy in impact. Another factor next year is that we can already see in other appointments that there's going to be some significant amount of FDA expertise elsewhere in the government. Notably, former Commissioner Kessler is going to be heading the warp speed effort. Sarah Dupree from the Pew will be an advisor to the secretary. She is an expert on FDA policy, a lot of focus on antibiotics and OTC, but I think her expertise goes well beyond that. Topher Spiro, who's going to head health programs at O and D, has some knowledge of FDA. FDA is going to be topic of discussion with the new head for diversity in health programs, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, Jeffrey Zantz, who's heading the COVID-19, and then Beth Cameron, who is over in the National Security Council and has been charged with reviving the effort to see biotechnology and biosecurity as critical areas, whether it's intentional or emerging infectious diseases. Now, the bottom line on that is it can be really good to have friends in high places, and it also can be a problem if they get in the habit of trying to second guess the commissioner of FDA. So that's an unknown, a mixed bag. It's something to keep an eye on. I would hope that it would be a situation where everybody was pulling in the same direction. So on that, I will turn it back to Zan.
Well, also another wow, Stephen, that was superb. I don't know where I could have gotten that summary anywhere, just invaluable. We now do turn to my dear friend, Tim Franson, also one of the preeminent punsters in the world, and we're expecting that we'll get a few puns here and there, Tim. But you know the agency probably as well as anybody in or outside of it. In fact, I thought that we might even give you an office while you were representing a big pharma company through much of your career. But you've got so much other experience to comment on or draw from. Give us your unique way of looking to the year to come.
Well, thanks very much, Zan. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to so many friends of long standing who I see are on the participant list. And to just wrap back to Stephen momentarily, I'd give a wow in a different sense. My grandson informed me that WOW is just an acronym for World of Warcraft. And clearly you highlighted that as a major concern. And in the war against expertise, we must achieve a ceasefire, no doubt about it. What I would like to do in looking at FDA is take a different approach here and talk about p-values. No, not statistical aspects, but certainly matters of significance. And putting on my grandfatherly hat, let's use the Sesame Street perspective. 5 words, starting with the letter P, all rolling up to the capital P, which is PDUFA. And so with that broad brush, let me talk about those 5 elements just as a matter of framing how we might think of the future of FDA. Those 5 Ps are people, process, policy, portfolio, and most importantly, patients. So as we talk about people, I'm sure we could get into discussions of candidates and so forth and Stephen's already nicely covered what some of the possibilities and certainties may be. I think it's important as we look ahead to think about the impact of leadership agendas and changes, but also to remember that post-reorganization, especially at CEDAR, attention to support of review staff in both new talent and new tools are absolutely vital to continuing their productivity. And that leads me to the second P on process, which may be productivity as well. I'd give a big shout out to FDA for great performance in a crazy year. Wow, yow, and holy cow. When you think about not only COVID and what has been done there, but also, as you've already heard from David, oncology, rare diseases, really remarkable. So certainly think we owe a debt of gratitude to those devoted parties who worked so hard on all those matters. Third P, policy. Certainly, we've seen some interesting indications of what FDA's agenda will be with the rollout of the 2021 list of guidance targets. And I think Frank will be talking about a few highlights of that in a moment. I think it's always important to recall that the interpretation of regulations and guidance is certainly a matter that requires our attention, and the more that we can collaborate and understand each other across the various stakeholder constituencies of regulators, industry, investigators, and so forth, the more we will be able to do the right things for patients. And we'll talk about a little more policy in the roll-up capital P here in a moment. In terms of portfolio, I liked David's summaries on the matters and especially highlighting oncology and rare disease. I'd like to give us a slightly different historical perspective in a general sense. When I first became involved in regulatory affairs in the mid-1980s, the focus on clinical trials, pre-PDUFA, if you will, were for acute care products. There were short trials and small molecules. And now we're looking at a portfolio in decade 3 of the 2000s, chronic diseases, complex clinical trials, and gene therapy, cell therapy, and numerous things that bring to bear very different benefit risk considerations. So more attention to those things and hopefully more collaboration with FDA on redefining some of those areas would be key. So let me get to the fifth of the P's, the P values, patients. I think voice of the patient has been a tremendous growth area and needs to continue as we think about how patient-focused drug development has been incorporated at FDA. It's certainly a subset of benefit risk, and by using patient voice and being able to quantitate that, I think we're able to get much better understanding of patients' views on benefits, especially their expectations beyond just survival. And the use of preference studies, as with the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community, has been really fascinating in terms of its impact on benefit risk, on how FDA has contributed to thinking about those areas and redefining how you measure feel, function, as well as survive. And that also, through preference studies, has allowed patient communities to communicate to practitioners and regulators what's important in terms of risk tolerance. And when there are unmet medical needs, what latitude can regulators anticipate that patients will feel are reasonable and justified for the hope of a benefit, advancement, or cure. So those are all very exciting things, and I think have been transformational. So great credit in those areas, and the things that we may build on more are patient engagement in new areas. And the examples I would give were patient community generated guidances, both Duchenne muscular dystrophy and ALS communities, independently authored guidance, which normally is generated by FDA, and that FDA reviewed and embraced and modified those and helped incorporate the importance of patient voice and how we look at benefit and risk. So those are really exciting developments that are kind of the foundational pieces we hope that industry, FDA, and practitioner communities will continue to build on collaboratively. And that gets me to the final big P, as Big Bird might say, in terms of PDUFA 7. Of course, PDUFA is the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, although our policy wonks would say it's also an acronym for Please Don't Undercut Federal Appropriations. Always a debate about how do you keep that balance from industry user fees and what the government should reasonably support for FDA. I think that as we get to PDUFA 7, and I've had the privilege to work with many of you beginning in PDUFA 2, and I think we've certainly seen this grown from being only a focus on review matters to expand our toolbox on safety and other areas. What now do we need to look at to keep, expand, or delete in PDUFA? Clearly, things like gene therapy warrant our additional attention. It has many great benefits and also some newly observed toxicities that we need to understand better. And I would just close here, Zan, with my wish list on PDUFA based on a few of the things I've already described, that it would be delightful to see the next PDUFA period here, as it's now being negotiated, to consider things like how do we better incorporate patient voice in labeling? How do we improve our data infrastructure so that there's much more shared platforms between industry and regulators? Clearly, there's already been mention of diversity in clinical trials, very important for understanding how different groups of demographics influence how we respond to drugs. One more thing that we can use from the learning in the COVID era is how do we bridge what we've learned from emergency use authorizations to how we might apply some of those efficiencies to full approvals. It clearly won't fully translate, but it would be exciting. And finally, what more can we do for infectious disease developments and incentives? Yes, I'm speaking with my hat on as an infectious disease physician, but from a policy sense, with antimicrobial resistance, with the next pandemic, which almost certainly will happen, how do we be more proactive in thinking about ways to continue to incent the development of new agents to the anticipated future pathogen challenges? So with all of that, let me stop there. I know Frank's going to have some very interesting and stimulating things to share with us. So thanks for the opportunity, Zan, and colleagues.
Wonderful, Tim. Another wow. You made me nostalgic for PDUFA 1. I think back to those days in the early 90s. Carl Peck, Mary Jo Veverka, reinventing government initiative with Al Gore. Steve, of course, Commissioner at that time, Kessler. Those were days where the FDA really made a major change in its capability. And wow, we're to PDUFA 7. That was a wonderful summary, and we thank you for that. Now, to Frank Sasinowski. Everybody knows that Frank is a guiding light, even a founding father of the orphan product world. And yet, Frank has so much more that he has done and is involved in. In fact, it's well known that Frank was a candidate for commissioner at one time, and might have been so if an election had gone the other way. Frank, I don't think you have to tell us if you're a candidate now, but you do bring wonderful expertise, and we're just delighted to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Zan, for your kind words. And, you know, it is, you know, you're remarking about PDUFA 1. I remember that when Waxman called and he said, can I send you his draft piece of legislation? I'm having the commissioner of FDA and pharma come up to my office later. We're doing a final look at PDUFA 1, what became. And I'd like to send you the draft and see if you have anything to say. And I said a couple things. I said, for instance, it doesn't address 505(b)(2)s at all. And it doesn't have an exemption for orphan drugs. And it should have an exemption for user fees for an orphan drug. So, you know, looking back on Zan, you and Tim and Stephen, you know, I'm thinking, wow, just look at the collective wisdom. I mean, Dave is the kid. He's the kid on our block. But you know, it's an honor for me to be on this panel as it was last year. So I have 4 kind of wows topics, and some of them have been touched on because we didn't rehearse. So we didn't know exactly what I was going to say. So I'll truncate some of the things I was going to say. But I was going to talk about the O and D reorganization, since that just was announced December 2019. So 2020 was really a year to see it going. COVID, what are the implications? What's it going to mean? 3, we've heard Tim talk about patient-centered drug development, so I won't say much more, but a few things. And lastly, about every quarter of a century, we have major changes in the standards of patient benefit. You know, how do we evaluate effectiveness of therapies? So we had the 62 law, the 1997 law with the 1998 FDA guidance. And now we've had some other, I think, very important movements. So I'm going to talk about each of those 4 very quickly. First, the O and D reorganization. I mean, there's been a flattening of structure, obviously. What has that meant? That in the past, FDA would often mentor or groom new leadership within a division. Well, we had so many new divisions and so many new offices that FDA didn't have an opportunity to do that same process. So we have people who are moving into positions of leadership without having had what would have conventionally been a certain training period. And what does that mean? Well, I had 3 meetings this week. 2 of them were with division directors who were newly appointed because of the O and D reorganization. What happened in those meetings is that what we see, and I'll go back because some of us are graybeards. If you had a meeting that was going to be led by, you know, Ray Lipicki or Paul Lieber, you know, you didn't have to worry about the other FDA people saying much because they wouldn't get a chance to say much more because Paul or Ray would control that meeting from the FDA side of the table. In these meetings, because these people are coming up, they're new and they're in leadership, so there's more diversity of opinion. You hear more FDA voices at the table. So around these meetings, you hear a lot more. What does that mean? That means that in 2 of these 3 meetings I was in this week, the FDA asked the other FDAers to stay on the call because they had to resolve some inconsistencies. They had to come to consensus positions on where they were. And so they could write official minutes of that meeting and put it down as a post-meeting note, you know, to the sponsor. So that's one thing that I think the O and D reorganization, which just kicked in, you know, in 2020, but we're still seeing it kind of marinate, you know, mature is a better word, in 2021. So I think it's a big wow. The other part about that is Janet Woodcock and the O and D reorganization gave new visibility and responsibility to the regulatory specialists within CDER. So instead of just organizing meetings and taking care of administrative matters, they are now given their own organizational units and more responsibility. For instance, in these meetings that I had this week and all the meetings lately, you will get in the preliminary comments sometimes a very extensive introductory section written by the regulatory specialist, which will describe the disease, describe the therapy, including, you know, the putative mechanism of action, talk about all the regulatory interactions with highlights. So it frames the entire discussion. It frames all the preliminary comments to the specific questions. And it helps people, like if you're going to have a very busy office director or division director who's kind of parachuting into the meeting, it kind of sets a groundwork for that. And it's very helpful. So I think also part of the O and D reorganization is that I think it's been very helpful in my meetings to get that orientation at the beginning, because why? The sponsor might put that in their briefing book, but it won't have the same traction with the FDA colleagues because it's written by the sponsor. So when this is coming at the front of the FDA preliminary comments, all the FDAers read it, understand it, and they trust it as being kind of objective, fair kind of presentation. So it starts the whole discussion of what you want to have discussed as sponsor, and I think a very constructive way. So I think O and D reorganization, we're still seeing fallout benefits. So I think it's a huge wow, and I'm looking forward in 2021 to seeing more wow. Second topic was talking about COVID. Oh my God. When, as was noted when we met last year for this Wow or Yeow, was just a few weeks before it turned all of us into a virtual world. And what happened within the month of March? I mean, I had face-to-face meetings with FDA the first week of March. By my meetings the second week of March, they were turned into virtual meetings. And still within the month of March, the FDA came out with its first guidance on COVID to say, make sure you're going to ensure patient safety and make sure you do everything to preserve the integrity of the study so that the findings will be credible and interpretable. That's amazing. The turnaround time, the FDA ability to have seen what was necessary and to get it out there to all of us so that we could all understand. Just this month, you know, the FDA came out with a new guidance document on how, because of COVID, you should be concerned with cell and gene therapies about implications of COVID for cell and gene therapy manufacturing. So the FDA continues to develop new guidance to help all of us because of the COVID implications. I think that it's a huge wow that the FDA has been able to manage its traditional function so that, as Dave Fox explained, we had 43 new chemical approvals in 2020. They're able to do all that while shouldering an enormous burden of trying to look at therapeutics and vaccines for COVID, which has taken people out of their normal divisions that would be looking at INDs and NDAs and BLAs for other things, and they're volunteering time to work on COVID therapeutics and COVID vaccines. So all this, I think it's a huge wow to FDA for doing that. Three, Tim, you did a great job on patient-centered drug development. So I was thinking about other things I could say. I had a meeting this month in which the division director at the end of the meeting said to the patient, the head of the patient organization who was part of our meeting, said, you know what, I'd like to have a separate meeting with you. Can we have a separate phone call? I mean, that shows you, I mean, go back just 5 years ago, you know, we would never have seen that. I've been a huge proponent of having the patient voice, you know, integrated into the whole drug development process. And so I'm thrilled to see the continued maturation of the integration of the patient voice into the process. And the old world, what I would say is it was a paternalistic system. It was, you know, the academic community, the medical community, the drug industry, with the help of regulators, would decide what patients needed and what they were going to get without ever talking to a patient. You needed to have them in trials. They were kind of objects, you know, to objectify them. But they didn't have a voice. They did not have a place at the table. To see how far we have come, and I see no let up in the continued emergence of the role of the patient in that process, huge wow. And lastly, that thing that I might have tickled your fancy with when I said, look, every 25 years, every quarter of a century, we touch upon, you know, how much benefit has to be there for a new therapy. 62 amendments, the 1997 FDAMA law, and the 1998 clinical evidence of effectiveness guidance document. The next piece was December 19th, 2019, when FDA came out with its guidance on substantial evidence of effectiveness. 4 pages of that guidance was devoted to the 1997 law. And now FDA, in its forecast that just published this week or late last week, I forget, they published their list of guidances that they anticipate having in 2021. Included among them is a new guidance on single study approvals with confirmatory evidence. So the 4 pages out of that December 2019 guidance, which was all about the 1997 law, is now going to get its own guidance. So we're going to have that. And I talked to Dr. Temple, all he would confirm for me, because I said, are you really coming out with this? And, you know, he says, you know, Frank, I can't talk to you about what's in it, you know, but I just want to know the process. Is it yes? And he said, yes, we're working on it. We're going to have this process. And that's amazing to look at that attention that the FDA is devoting to it. And here are 2 other things to consider. The FDA this month came out with a guidance on N of 1. That is where you have maybe it's the only patient in the world, or usually it's defined roughly as up to 10 in the world. So when you have that kind of that uniqueness of patient population to be served, the FDA came out with its first guidance document as to what do you need to do for manufacturing? What do you need to do for preclinical? What do you need to do for clinical? I mean, it's a start. It doesn't, but look how that's going to have to adjust the 1962 two adequate and well-controlled positive studies. I mean, there's going to be a huge, effect of that N of 1. And that's because we have these new targeted therapies, like all of you are talking about, cell and gene therapies. We can go after these. And the last thing I was going to say is January 19th, FDA published in the Federal Register. I'm telling you that so you can go read these. The actual FDA approval letters that were sent to Pfizer and Moderna. Read those. They talk about that standard, which was created under the Project BioShield Act of 2004, which is the EUA standard, which the standard of efficacy is it may be effective based upon a totality of evidence in which the potential and known benefits outweigh the potential and known risks. Wow, what a different standard. So I think that when we start looking at this, we are at a pivotal moment in time in which suddenly there seems to be this convergence of focus on, again, how are we going to define benefit for very small populations like N of 1, for emergencies like the EUA, for a 1997 law that's finally going to see articulated, what FDA thinks about that as an extension of the December 2019 guidance. Another huge wow. I think it's a moment to step back and look at that. I have some things to say about rare diseases, but I'm only going to say one thing right now. And that is that there are no red states or blue states that have rare disease patients. There are only our brothers and sisters with rare diseases. So is this a way to bring the House, bring the Congress, bring the country together if we focus on something that is inherently a bipartisan issue? Whether it's, Patty Murray as the chair of the HELP committee, if that's what's going to happen, and Burr as the ranking minority member from North Carolina, he's had a strong interest in rare diseases. On the House side, if it's Fred Upton, who was the author of the 21st Century Cures, he chaired the first hearing on that. And Frank Pallone, who's always from New Jersey, has had a big interest in rare disease. Can we bring together, can we focus on rare diseases as a unifying theme that needs to get done? Because in November 2020, NIH published a paper in which it said in the opening paragraphs, at the rate at which we are approving new therapies for rare diseases, it will be another 2,000 years before we have one therapy for every one of the 7,000 rare diseases. That's NIH. Most people will not be around in 2,000 years to see that therapy. So we need to do something to change the structure of what we're doing for rare diseases. And maybe if we draw from the emergency use authorization standard, if we draw from an N of 1 standard, if we draw from this 1997 law, maybe we together can come to an understanding of a better place to be for therapies for rare diseases. Thanks, Ann.
Well, another wow, Frank, and that was not only masterful, but inspirational as well. I really can't think of a more integrated summary of what really is important for FDA going forward in this year and looking back. We're going to start a round robin in a moment. We'll stay on COVID a little bit. We don't want to overdo that. That's been obviously, as alluded to, a household topic that may get tiresome. But we would like to have some exchanges here. And note that you can, in the audience, provide questions. Thomas is the master MC of questions. He will take your question off the chat line and put them to the panel when we come to open the floor for questions in a moment. But going back to COVID, and everybody, all the panelists should open your mics and just chime in without being recognized. And fine if we step on each other. Um, what's going to be the new normal for FDA after COVID? What has been catalytic in a positive way from COVID, and what is continuing to be a challenge? For example, are we robbing Peter to pay Paul in some respects? Are we not able to offer the attention to chronic therapeutic development that we're wanting to do, as well as face the pandemic? So let's take a comment from, well, I see, Frank, your mic is still open. Go ahead.
All right. What I have to say is that, that to me, what we've seen, because I was focused a little bit more on Cedar. And so I'm thinking about CBER. I mean, I'm doing an hour-long fireside chat on gene therapy this afternoon. And so as I think about CBER and OTAT, I think about last year at this time, I said at this meeting that OTAT was the most oversubscribed review unit inside Cedar or CBER that I've seen in my, whatever they are, 37 years of doing this or something. So that was before COVID. And given that the number of INDs for gene therapies and cell therapies only continues to grow, and given that there's been tremendous pressure on Peter Marks and CBER, understandably, to pay attention to COVID vaccines, the stress that COVID has caused, on those reviews. For instance, I have to say, I'll say this, and I don't mean to be critical, but I think it's just practical reality. I see more clinical holds on INDs for cell therapies and gene therapies. I think they don't have time, so I see more clinicals. I see more requests for meetings that get not denied, but changed to written response only. So you see implications of things for, I think, very important development of targeted therapies that somehow are being given less attention, understandably less attention, because of the demands of COVID. So I don't know how we get out of that box. I don't know if there's some way that PDUFA 7, because I think that FDA, both CBER and Cedar, and Steve can speak to this better. He's the founder of the Alliance. Steve, I ask you to speak to this, but it seems to me like the Alliance has done a great job getting enough FTEs, enough authorization for slots into Cedar and CBER, but then they don't get filled. And when I'm told by senior people at FDA, and I won't mention names, you figure it out, that what I'm told is it's personnel process, that sometimes it might take a year to bring somebody on board. So is there a way in PDUFA 7 to have an exemption, from the process, so that we can, on an emergency basis, get people quickly, not without a year's delay going through Office of Personnel Management, but get them to on an emergency basis?
Okay, I'm going to split that question for a reason. FDA needs more resources. It would be a mistake if that came primarily from user fees. It needs to come from user fees, but needs much more. That's what the Alliance is about, the Alliance for Stronger FDA. And I will probably twist the arm of Zan and Thomas so I can send a follow-up letter to everybody, so that if you're interested, you can contact me. But the cell and gene therapy is an area we've emphasized because the funding and the staffing was based on assumption that the growth would be just slight. And what happened, in fact, is they went from 300 INDs to close to 1,000 INDs in about 18 months. It's impossible to staff to that level without the resources. And it's a problem throughout FDA, although cell and gene therapy is certainly a particular problem. In fact, the larger problem it's part of is that new science is going quicker than FDA can fund. We have artificial intelligence, we have blockchain, all sorts of tools and insights that we didn't have 12 months ago, 36 months ago. In terms of the personnel, I'll say this because the personnel rules are difficult, and 21st century cures gave FDA some new tools. I think there's some thinking that more tools may be needed. But this is something that's very much on FDA's mind. And, there'll be a new secretary, I think, with some new openness to what's required and an ability, and I'll put it this way, an ability to understand that if you're going after scientific personnel who are being recruited by government, who are possibly on an academic calendar, and you say 6 months to hire, what are they going to do with their family? How they're going to grab an offer, or they're going to renew their contract at the university. So these are serious problems. This is not something. I guess I would offer the following: if we're simple to solve, it would have already been solved. But that doesn't mean it isn't important and need to be solved.
So Zan, let me offer a comment, and it follows on Stephen's. And that is, we're talking about the workload at FDA and much of it driven by INDs. At what point should we reconsider user fees for INDs? Because right now, user fees are primarily based on the folks who are successful at the end of the process. But the workload is at the front end, where essentially there is no pay, if you will, or no pay in. So I think that has to be looked at as a consideration. And then let me just flip over for one other comment, and in a more holistic sense. I think one of the things that COVID has brought us is in this virtual world is the lack of ability to develop some of the relationships that have occurred in the past. And the one that I recall specifically relates to drug-induced liver injury, the DILI work groups that began with pharma, FDA, and AASLD, and the understandings created there and the common cause for standards and interpretations were incredibly healthy for all the communities. We aren't going to be able to achieve that in a virtual environment.
Great point. David Fox.
Yeah, well, two quick notes, much more macro level. One is with all the things flooding into the agency and all the resource constraints we're talking about, it concerns me that more and more FDA is imposing sort of its own, or having to make its own value judgments as to where to prioritize its resources. And I think there really is emerging, it's becoming sharper and sharper, kind of sort of a two different approval pathways, or two different development pathways, sort of the haves and the have-nots, or this, inequality that we talk about in our society. But you translate that into FDA, there are those for whom there's enormous flexibility and engagement, and there are those for whom it's written response only, very arm's length, very, very sort of rigid classical approach. And which side of the line you fall into is critical, and it's make or break, and that's all being decided internally by FDA, imposing sort of their, whose values. Now, obviously, with COVID, we all know that the resources should be, all in on COVID. So there's no dispute about that. But I think once you get beyond COVID, I think it's a little bit worrisome to think about how different the agency can behave. They can be super flexible in one case. They can be reverting back to classical rigidity in other cases. And it's hard to account for when they're on which side, and whose values really are coming through there. The second piece, we all know as FDA historians, there are these milestone events that then carry over for sometimes decades or more in influencing FDA. All the instances we know of, usually safety driven, where there's a safety event and then the pendulum swings, and for a decade or so, FDA overcompensates on the side of safety. One has to wonder with COVID whether this is one of the first times we're going to see the pendulum swing decidedly on the efficacy side, and maybe FDA come to the realization that they can act very fast, and the sky doesn't necessarily fall in, and giving physicians as many tools as possible to try may, can work in other disease settings other than oncology. And so that's, perhaps a lasting effect of COVID.
Thanks, David. And gosh, we've got so many more things we could talk about related to COVID and what it's done and will do to the agency. But let's press on. I'm going to pluck a question out of the audience. My good friend Glenn Park has asked about inspections. That's a big topic. It's certainly one that's being affected right now by the pandemic. Could we do a quick roundtable on inspections as an issue, present and future?
So Zan, this is Frank. That one thing that I've with sponsors I was working with, one thing that the sponsors were offering was, look, we understand you can't come out, but we know you need to inspect. We'll set up kind of virtual inspections. You'll set up cameras everywhere. We'll have, you can look at anything. We'll make everything available. And yet, so COVID has taught us that we can do a lot virtually. Look what we're doing now with Wow or Yeow. Instead of meeting, at a hotel in Washington and having everybody in, but and telemedicine, so much we've been able to accomplish in transitioning, conventional trials into these, telemedicine trials. But the inspectional side, seems not to have gotten the same traction, from being able to move in the virtual. So I don't have a comment on that because I'm not a specialist in, GMPs and FDA inspections and stuff. So I don't know how impossible it would be to conduct, that kind of inspection in a virtual world. I don't know. I know I've had sponsors who are very sophisticated, who have offered, to open up their offices and in as intense a way as FDA could ask, and yet that we haven't gotten there. So maybe that's something to have some, test cases to explore having this, because that would save a lot in terms of the FDA inspectorate. I know Peter Smith a long time ago set up the FDA foreign inspection program. And they, FDA inspectors traveling all over the world, obviously. And maybe this could be another advantage of what we've learned to do because of COVID, just like so many other benefits that were completely unanticipated.
And good point, Frank. We do have a global village of therapeutic product manufacturing. We have FDA offices in China and India. And it is a global challenge. In fact, it also relates to this initiative to bring some manufacturing back to the US as a national security issue. So chime in on those issues, panel.
Well, I just to follow up on Frank's point, and I think in terms of creativity in how inspections are done, I think there's plenty of room for improvement. But just to invoke fear and loathing in Las Vegas, as your lawyer, Frank, we have to remember, all the times we've counseled our clients, never let FDA video your manufacturing site. So we need clear understanding of how that video could be used and how enduring a piece of evidence it might be. But your point, as always, exceptionally well taken.
Thank you, Counselor.
I'm not sure that this is limited to just GMP matters. When you think about pre-approval inspections, also site visits for validation of data. So this is really GXPs, GMP, GCP, GLP. And we really need to figure out ways to leap over this. It's not anyone's fault, but we can all work on possible solutions. I'm just not sure where you begin that.
Well, I think the place to begin is there needs to be some pilots, and it's not clear to me, because it's not an area I follow, whether those pilots are being organized and set in place. But that's how you test new ideas that challenge conventional orthodoxy, one at a time, a half dozen at a time, with validation. Pilots.
Well, before we go to questions from the audience, maybe, Stephen, you could comment on the current publicly announced candidates for FDA commissioner. Not that you would tip your hat to either one, because they're both outstanding, but they are different in their backgrounds. And you are a master in analyzing the different attributes of these two different people. So give us your thoughts about the scenario under Dr. Woodcock or under Dr. Sharfstein.
Well, I think first to say that they are both good, and that I don't think anybody on this panel has an interest in saying, oh, A should win, and when B wins, not being able to work with them. So they're great people. We all know them. And this is an assumption, of course, that it's Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Sharfstein, which is not by any means a given. But if it is those two individuals, I think that for Dr. Woodcock, the strength is that she reflects continuity. She reflects a decision to reinvest in the expertise and experience that's in the agency. So I think there's a lot of sentiment on her behalf. Now, there are two things that are problematic for her, one of which is we haven't had a civil servant commissioner in at least 30 years. The second thing is that having a long public record is both a blessing and a curse. In Dr. Sharfstein's case, one obvious advantage to me is, oh, good, we're looking at two candidates who both have FDA experience. What a huge advantage that is. We got Dr. Gottlieb 4 years ago, but it was by no means certain that it was going to work out that way. And we were looking at people who had no understanding of FDA possibly putting in charge. So there's no bad choice here. I think that Dr. Sharfstein represents, he is a candidate being advanced by the more progressive wing of the party. I think, frankly, they're going to be a little disappointed because I think he's not going to be as dramatic or radical as they might hope. That's typically interests that would like to see the agency be a little more cautious and a little bit slower in embracing its work with industry. I think, in fact, that's not going to what would happen if he were chosen, but I think that's part of the issue of, is it the continuity they'll want to emphasize, or do they want to start with someone who's going to bring a little bit of fresh ideas, but still understands the organization? If he does become commissioner, I suspect that there'll be a few areas that will slow down, but an awful lot will still be the FDA we've known and say prior to 2020 that's moving forward.
Great. Well, time is running out for this panel. It's time to go to the audience. And if you will take it away, Thomas, give us a few questions. Or while you're keying up your mic.
Yeah, I was on mute. So going back to the top of the chat board, Kerry Kuhn was asking, what do you think the chances are that the FDA could become a separate entity from HHS? It's a pretty radical change. I don't know whether, Stephen, you would want to field it first, but I'd throw it out to the panel.
Well, I am willing to. The Alliance for Stronger FDA has 150 members that's across the entire gamut of FDA stakeholders, consumer and patient groups, research advocates, health profession societies, companies, trade groups, across food, drug, et cetera. I have not taken a poll of my members, but I think I can safely say they're all over the place on this. I think there's a lot of, well, what does it really mean? The idea of being independent has a certain appeal, but what if that winds up meaning that there's actually nobody to speak on your behalf at cabinet meetings? That might be a loss. So I think there's a lot that hasn't been said. It's an idea that has some support, but it's not matured yet. And I think that until that happens, that most segments of FDA regulated industries are going to say, well, maybe, and maybe the dialogue will continue and we'll get a better sense what it really means. I will say this, the notion that an independent agency with cabinet level status has not worked for EPA.
Good point.
Yeah, we can look at Brexit as a potential cross-learning experience.
So, looking over the questions, some of them are specific to FDA, others are in the broader point of HHS or pricing reimbursement questions, and we can certainly get to that. This panel, I'm sure, will have certain ideas about that. And I also mentioned that we've been focused on drug development. There are certainly device people in the House, and there are implications of COVID for what has impacted CDRH and their schedules. But just a review, just to go back to a couple of the questions here. What enforcement efforts, this is Michelle Mattei, can we expect from FDA OCI under the new administration related to counterfeit and diverted drugs, especially since the vast majority are coming out of China? And that ties to the drug or active independence point that Dave Fox addressed earlier. Dave, looks like you have something to say to that.
Sure. Well, so part of this comes down, I think, to regulatory philosophy between the past administration and the new administration. And I'd expect on the new administration to see kind of reverting back to more of the closed system where, FDA is the guardian. So less openness to importation, less openness to, trying to bring in international index pricing and things like that. I mean, that, the Democratic administrations, when it comes to FDA, have actually, been quite protective of the agency's turf. I can't tell whether this is a carryover from the last administration or is actually an indicator, but just within the last couple of days, we've seen a couple of very significant, I think, notice of violation and warning letters going out to some major pharmacy compounders. Some of which involve, I think, the very question that's being asked about the use within compounded medicines of imported bulk material that is suspect. And kind of the translation of the warning letters is that the compounders have to do a much better job of ensuring the integrity of the bulks that they're using. So I think it's interesting that these letters came out in the new administration. Maybe they were sitting around at FDA. I don't have enough visibility to know whether they were sitting there and compliance wanted to issue them, but the new administration was protective of compounders and didn't want to, but they came out, and that could be, part of the indicator. So I think my expectation in response to this question is, yes, I'd expect a step up in enforcement, including looking carefully at the quality of material coming into the country.
Go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, Zan. I just wanted to say that the issue of counterfeit and substandard medicines are not limited to the US in terms of risks to population. So FDA has been collaborating with the US Pharmacopoeia as well as other bodies of that nature in order to help up with the surveillance and standards being imposed, not just in the US, but elsewhere. So we ought to look at much broader collaborative efforts for that.
I wanted to tack on the somewhat related issue of collaboration of FDA with other international authorities. We could spend a whole hour on that, but what about EMA, TGA, other very competent authorities and joint reviews of licensing applications, ICH? Any quick comments from the panel? And I threw a lot at you, so we don't have to stay on that. But just to say, there has been a great several decades of growing collaboration among EMA and FDA, for example, on orphan drug review, joint reviews of some selected therapeutic areas. So just to mention that in passing.
I mean, on the inspectional front, Zan, FDA itself has said that it wants to rely more on inspections from its foreign partners, and so I think that is going to solidify, and I think COVID's accelerating that.
Right.
It's one of the alternative methods that FDA is using to do inspections now is reliance on local regulators.
And I think there's been a lot of progress and general agreement on a number of the ICH standards that have been adopted, and FDA has been very good that way. And there are a few exceptions where it has not been so consistently embraced, as with Q14 E14 with the QT prolongation matters and how the various principalities view that. So we could look at that in balance. Overall, the progress has been great.
I could raise a couple of questions here. The Biden administration has been active in sort of undoing many of the things that went on in the last administration. Kelly Leonhardt was asking if HHS does not overturn the LDT ruling in the next couple of months, is FDA responsible for analyzing LDTs for efficacy against the variants in the COVID-19 strains? Or would HHS be responsible? Christopher Hopkins asked, it seems the genetic engineered animal models are a tool to address rare, yet it was mentioned the FDA no longer guides this. Does this position need to be reversed so rare can be better addressed? What is your understanding about some of those more technical reversals that may or may not come?
And just to say, we're bad about using jargon. LDT is
laboratory
developed test.
Right, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stephen or anybody want to comment? This is a crystal ball issue or Ouija board issue, so I guess it's a practical issue. If it's not reversed, what happens for now?
Well, I don't think I can offer anything on the practical level, but I think I've already pointed out that that there's reason to be hopeful that some of those conflicts are going to get straightened out with a secretary's office that is more overtly supportive of FDA. That's a hope. That's not a promise. It's too soon to know, and that perhaps we won't get into a situation where there's a misalignment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on the LDT front, and I'm definitely not a scholar in this area, but I don't think the current policy is sustainable. That the prior administration's policy is sustainable. First, for one thing, the service providers and manufacturers of the LDT are not covered, I think, by the PrEP Act, so they don't have liability protection. So that ultimately, I think they do want to come in for some degree of FDA oversight. And I don't know that HHS is set up or has the expertise to look at the performance of the tests.
For sure.
I mean, there's some inspectional capability under CLIA, but it's a completely different. It moves at a completely different pace. So I think Steve's exactly right. I think HHS is going to go where the expertise is, and they're going to recognize only FDA really can, in real time, evaluate those tests. And I think we will get a new policy that will replace the old one. I just don't think the current policy is sustainable. The virus it's a force of nature, and it's moving a lot faster than the regulators. And you just have to, the regulators are just gonna have to respond to that and go where people are set up to do the work, and that's FDA.
Okay. Josh asks, any thoughts on the future breakthrough designation and streamlined reimbursement for Medicare, Medicaid? I know that there are different standards for the drug side and the device side. Are there any movements? And I think I've heard previously, Dave or others of you mentioned that when whether by rule or by legislation, certain areas are deemed more special than others, pretty soon, if everybody's special, no one's special. And so it's a balancing act. But any comments?
On as follows. It's an area that's ripe for rationalization, and whether or not CMS and FDA are going to be able to have a fruitful dialogue is an unknown. It's going to be all new players.
And Frank, what about other provisions? For example, orphan products, pediatric voucher, any comments?
Let me say this, Zan, on that you know, just David earlier mentioned the Biogen Alzheimer's drug November 6th AdCom, and people were looking at that as like whether it's going to be an indicator for how FDA is going to be handling, you know, these kind of breakthroughs and these other things. And just today, this morning, the FDA announced that the PDUFA date in March has now been extended by 90 days. So, you know, I think that there's people were looking at that as a harbinger. You know, is this, you know, Dave characterized it that maybe we've seen the limits of how far the FDA flexibility can go. And maybe it's, I think Dave's colorful words, poetic words were snap. You know, so, I think that's something that we saw today. Something else, I'm sorry, this wasn't directly answering your question, but something else Steve was talking about with the two excellent candidates for commissioner. I mean, Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Sharfstein. Today's trade press talked about how Dr. Sharfstein's been supported by people who are concerned about opioids and by Public Citizen are supporting him. And I know it hasn't been reported in the press, but I know that I'm vice chair of the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. We helped organize and got 82 rare disease patient organizations to sign a letter supporting Dr. Woodcock, and had that submitted to President Biden on his first full day in office last Thursday. So, you know, I think there are good candidates, and I think that the rare disease patient population looks to Dr. Woodcock, not because we don't like Dr. Sharfstein, but we know with Dr. Woodcock, things like, look who she chose just to be her chief of staff, Julie Turney. Julie came from the Office of Chief Counsel, but she did a post. She volunteered and wanted to go to the Office of Orphan Products Development. She's the only chief. Liz Dickinson used to support orphan drug questions from her position within the Office of Chief Counsel. Julie Turney is the only, I think, FDA Office of Chief Counsel attorney who actually took a detail because she was interested in rare disease issues. And Janet Woodcock chose her to be her chief of staff. So, I mean, I think we in the rare disease community don't have anything against Dr. Sharfstein. We'd welcome him. But we know with Dr. Woodcock that she's a person who does listen to the voice of the rare disease patient.
Yeah, Dan, I would just add on the question, you know, breakthrough relates to the standard of benefit and risk. And at CMS, we're talking about value. And I'm not sure we've completely defined how those intersect.
Right. Yeah.
Zan, we've kind of come to the end of the allotted hour. I guess what I propose is that maybe we formally close the proceedings, but we keep the room open, the Zoom call open for people to mill around and turn on mics and what have you, and we can have follow-on questions. There were lots of questions, some more questions on orphan for Frank and other folks. I just want to thank everyone and wish everyone a great weekend. Zan, maybe you could formally close the proceedings and open up the cocktail hour.
Well, it has been a wonderful discussion. I can't thank our panelists enough. Just amazing. I look forward to next year and a few follow-up conferences that we'll do. It's a little too early for happy hour, but let's do have a convivial gathering as long as you'd like for the next half hour anyway, those who'd like to linger. But thanks again to my dear friends, and we'll hope to see you soon.
I saw Terry Ellsworth had a long question to Frank. Others who have follow-on questions, please feel free to. It's hard to recognize raised hands. We still have over 100 folks on the call, but let's see. Anybody wants to say something, please, let's try it.
I'll start by saying thank you guys for all the support and being aware and just participating in such awesome live events like this daily, pretty much. So thank you for the attendance and allowing me to listen and learn as a part of the group and a metaphysician in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Anyone else? Comments? Open your mic. This is an experiment. We haven't really done an open mic with a large crowd before.
I hope everybody plans to create more events like this in the future, because this really helps our mind as regulators or supporters of our current administration. We can think and act as one from the comfort of our own home, and we get continual updates whenever we're working like this. We're all live, we're all in focus, and we're all ready to make better decisions so that tomorrow is more profitable for everyone who is a part of this economic structure. So
So
thank you.
Brandon, thank you. We'll certainly do our part in putting on additional webinars. Anyone else have any question or comment?
Yes, I was wondering if any of the panelists thought that the FDA review and the choice of advisory committee related to the Biogen product is a harbinger of future FDA approaches to these type of difficult decisions where there's not a clear answer, and the 2019 guidance is really put front and center.
It's N of one.
Well,
we will think about.
It is a unique situation, and we could probably hear several different schools of thought about what FDA should do with that particular decision. But let's stay tuned.
Yeah, we do think of it as an N of one, and it was at the outer limits of how much flexibility FDA could show. But I found it interesting that there was another advisory committee meeting for a drug called Entresto, sacubitril valsartan. It's a heart disease drug, where the review division came out and volunteered that they had asked the sponsor to do a post hoc retrospective type analysis. And in that instance, the advisory committee embraced the analysis. And at that advisory committee, the review division, this was cardiorenal, also gave 4 other examples where they had undertaken post hoc analysis to essentially find an indication within the data set, which is, under the classic FDA rubric, a no-no. So I'm not so sure that the Biogen approach is really an N of one. I think it required maybe the most manipulation of the data, or more than we usually see. And it was interesting to see the reaction from the advisory committee members. And it may have been a presentation, the way it was presented, that drew that reaction from the advisory committee. And Frank mentions, it's interesting that the NDA, or it's a BLA, excuse me, it's a monoclonal antibody, remains under review. And in fact, the review clock was extended. So maybe that the final chapter has not been written yet on that. So I think there is more flexibility than maybe people recognize. And I think it's a question of, from a review division to review division and program to program, what is the principle that FDA really follows in determining when it's going to allow for some post hoc analysis, and when is FDA going to be rigid? And is that arbitrary? Is that just a value judgment, or is there indeed a regulatory standard that they're applying?
Yeah, David, I thought that was a very interesting comparison as well. And with Entresto, one of the interesting features that differed from the Biogen matter is there had been a prior approval for a
Yes.
different population. So there was a benefit risk foundation established. So this was building off of it. So there may be a difference there, but I agree with everything you've said.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the 4 examples that cardiorenal brought up in Entresto were all based off of prior approvals. So it was not a brand new entity. And that is a difference, but it's not a difference that you can, from which you can, pull something out of the statute or the regulations.
Right.
I mean, it may be something that FDA is applying itself, and sure, there's a level of comfort in the product you've already approved, but it comes down to interpretation of the substantial evidence standard. And the agency has always said that new indications for approved products require the same level of substantial evidence. So I don't want to go into the esoteric weeds there, but I'd like to see it as kind of a harbinger or going more out in the open about when FDA it can apply more flexibility.
Yep. Agreed.
David, what do you foresee when it comes to the rash of post-approval trials that are required as part of a subpart H or E approval, that is a conditional approval on a surrogate endpoint? We had the case of Xeljanz, very popular therapy, oral therapy for rheumatoid arthritis, having a negative trial reported yesterday. How do you think this is going to go down? Will there be a somewhat different standard, evidentiary standard for evaluating these post-marketing trials or post-approval trials?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Zan, and it kind of can hurt your head to think about it. Last year we talked about the number of approvals that FDA is issuing each year, and how as the body of approved products expands, the number of precedents expands, and each year it gets harder and harder to sort of for the agency to walk a straight line, or something resembling a straight line through its body of precedents. And when you approve, the more drugs you approved, the more things you need to try to align in a just some reasoned principle way. I think the agency is going to start to face that now with the body of accelerated approval products that it's approving. It used to be a handful, 1 or 2 exceptional cases. I said last year, every 4 products approved was accelerated approval. That's a large number of post-market studies that are going to have to be evaluated. And we know already that each one of those, unless it's done quickly, unless the second study is done quickly and is clearly positive for validating the surrogate, it becomes a tremendous mess for the agency. We saw that with Genentech's product and the hearings that were held, and the possibility of withdrawing a product from the market that's already being used. It becomes a huge problem when you have biosimilars and generics in the pipeline for those products, and then suddenly the sponsor who's doing the post-approval study says, I'm not going to bother anymore because the product's going generic. There really is not a very good regulatory system to deal with those post-market studies. It was all developed under, it's based off a regulation and then some pretty limited statutory language that came in later. But I think we're going to start to see the need for much more developed standards for assessment of those post-market studies.
I have a question that's kind of related, but not. I mean, there's going to be an overhang of emergency use authorizations. I'm just not familiar with what you do when the emergency is over, or certainly Pfizer or others are preparing full approval applications. But there's going to be, first of all, it's going to be an overhang and a lot of business. And the question is, how do you convert them on the basis of what level of evidence? Can people speak to that, please?
I mean, a quick one on that. No one has experience with that. I think on the vaccines, I think it's relatively straightforward. I think it's all about safety data. I mean, it's the preliminary nature of the data that necessitated the use of an EUA rather than a full approval was on the safety side, not the efficacy side. And so I think that's just a matter of getting, 6 months to 1 year follow-up data on safety for the vaccines.
And will we get to a steady state like we have for influenza vaccines, where it's not an EUA, it's a BLA approval, and it's not the same kind of sort of conditional approval to the vaccine going out?
Remdesivir, graduated from EUA.
Yeah, that's right.
We have a pretty good that was just a matter of completing the efficacy study, and FDA concluding that shortening hospital stays was enough efficacy to justify the approval under a full approval.
Gordon, you were putting a hand up.
Yeah, I was interested in the comment about the FDA meetings in the new era, the number of extra voices that we're hearing from some of the less experienced leaders of these meetings. And it was also just thinking about some of the meetings I've been to this year. On the one hand, I've been impressed with how well they work, but on the other, there is a challenge and sort of a little bit of anxiety on the part of the sponsors getting all their acts together, particularly if they have consultants like myself, and communicating in real time in the meeting. I know there's often a back line, we'll text you if you want this point, if and when, and so forth. And so I just wondered if the panel has any additional advice about how to make these meetings most effective, and any successes or pitfalls that they want to alert us to.
I think Frank had a lot of war stories, but I think he had to go off to his 1 hour gene therapy fireside chat. So
well,
go ahead.
I think the big question is going to be, how much does FDA continue to resort to the Zoom, they're not Zoom meetings, but teleconferences, essentially. They haven't really offered video conferences yet consistently, or even to any extent. So I think that remains a big question. Will we have a greater mix of video conferences, or something less than people showing up in White Oak?
Yeah, well, Gordon, it's good to see you again. And I would just add that, as with any meeting, it's even more critical when you're on phone only to make sure there's a level set. So I do agree with Frank's advice to try and frame exactly what the prior assumptions and understandings are. And that's good wherever we're in person, whenever we're in person or virtual.
Yeah. And Gordon, it's interesting that you raise this question as coming in as an outside expert, because speaking from a relatively limited sample size, but just as a practical matter, I think we've been able to integrate into our meetings a greater variety of people. Frank mentioned having a patient representative. We've had meetings with more experts, just by the sheer practicality that, because of remote participation, people are just more available. And I would say our preparation for meetings has actually gone better with remote coordination than trying to have everybody, fly in from all different parts of the country or the world to, stay in a hotel in Silver Spring and be away from their families and all the, I don't know that it's going to be very easy to go back to that method. That seems kind of primitive now. And I would say with our FDA meetings, we've actually done really well to bring in more voices in the room. So they're different. The meetings are different, but I can't say that we would say we would have done better had we been there in the room. And as you know, nowadays it's very hit or miss as to whether you get any opportunity for hallway chatter. I mean, you're pretty much ushered in and out. It's very, it's now, it's not the old days. And so you really don't get you can't really corner somebody. It's harder to do that.
You know,
Well,
I have been, I just would say too, I have been very impressed with, to the point about the voice of the patient, at how interested the agency seems. And I can recall at one of the meetings, after the meeting was over, even the division director was seeking out the patient advocate. This was actually right before the virtual meeting started. But seeking out and wanting to speak and thanking the patient advocate who actually had the disease in question in this case, and was very appreciative and very attentive to it.
Yeah, I'd like to give a slightly different but consistent slice to David about the value of doing calls and video conferences rather than in person, which is that you have a factor by which everybody's invested so much time in travel that you feel like you have to get your time. And it's more universal than anything that has to do with FDA. But if you don't have to come to Silver Spring multiple times to prepare, if an FDA conference can go 15 minutes, nobody's sitting there the way they would at White Oak saying, I did all of this and I'm only getting 15 minutes. So I think there's a positive upside, again, more universal than just FDA, that as people get used to not having to invest so much time in travel and prep, that our meetings are going to get more efficient and we're going to get closer to making decisions in efficient amounts of time.
So I see Delhi with her hand up. And Delhi, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, hi.
Welcome
yes,
to the
hi.
show.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very productive meeting. I'm very honored and appreciative of all your experience and wealth of information you've provided to us in the past hour and a half. So my question is regarding the J&J COVID-19 vaccine, which we found out today that has a 66% effectiveness. And I'm interested in hearing your opinion on would the FDA approve an EUA for this vaccine, and how would they promote public confidence when Moderna and Pfizer vaccines effectiveness is in the 90s? Thank you.
Terrific question. David, what would you say? I mean, this is a very tough call. I mean, it's clearly effective. It's not as effective, perhaps, but it's not a head-to-head comparison. So it's apples and oranges, and we do need vaccines of any kind. So how does the agency handle this? Well, and maybe it's a greater public health question, not so much for FDA to decide, but just to simply approve and put different alternatives out there.
Yeah, well, I would say call the premier former senior FDA reviewer, Sam Fleming. It's more, you know, I guess I'll sort of deflect because it's such a hard question. It's really, I mean, that you have to look at the data and see what the role of the vaccine would be in the community. And then, you know, an FDA is going to have to make a judgment call if it, you know, if having more, you know, a larger volume of vaccines is better than having only the best vaccines.
Well, that's not the FDA's call, I would argue, right? And I'm the non-regulator in this crowd, but I thought the FDA initially said that they would consider vaccines with 50% effectiveness. And my lay understanding is that we're having volume limitations and new strains coming out and so forth. So as you say, the FDA determines that it's safe and effective enough. I'm not familiar with a creeping standard of efficacy, but if it passes their standards, wouldn't you let the market or the state governments, I mean, not states, but governments determine which ones they want to procure and distribute and so forth?
Well, that 50% mark is, I think, more about power the study and the design of the study than a true setting of the desired effect size. So
I wouldn't think I do that.
I don't think 50. I'm not, and certainly in light of the performance of the two other vaccines, even then, even more so, I don't think you would hold on to 50% as.
And I seem to recall that it's a single
A single
shot.
dose.
Yeah.
Single dose. Yeah.
But I
Tim,
think
this is in Tim's bailiwick, his original infectious disease background here. What would you say, Tim?
Well, I was going to comment that there is first a regulatory standard and then secondly, a commercial standard, and it's much more nuanced than just with efficacy. I don't know what their benefit risk was, side effect profile, and you have to consider the compliance factor that nobody's going to have to get a second shot. So everyone who gets that vaccine is covered. Whether it will be commercially viable and whether folks will say it's not worth the trade-off to get one shot to have 20 to 30% less efficacy. But again, without the benefit and risk here, I think we should be cautious in an assessment.
Yeah, well, this points out a distinction between FDA and the traditional European approach. For FDA, the standard is safe and effective, not necessarily a comparative efficacy standpoint, although there have been cases, or there are certainly in infectious disease areas where you've got to have a certain comparable efficacy. But in Europe, it's you've got to show that you're better or equal to available therapies, and so it's a different approach.
Very, very important to me was that in addition to just the efficacy in preventing infection, is that if you looked at the group that had time to respond, I don't know, 4 weeks, whatever that was, not a single person was hospitalized. Not a single person died. So in theory, if everybody in this country had that, we would essentially have a death rate of about 0. Of course, this should be on the market. I don't think there's any question that it should be there. And it has essentially the same effectiveness with one shot as Moderna and Pfizer did at 4 weeks after one shot.
Good point.
This is Susan Alpert. I would add something. With the changes that are taking place in the virus, there's a question about what you need to be boosted with. And one of the things that we should be looking, I'm an infectious disease person. One of the things that we should be looking at, and will, I'm sure, be looked at, is that a booster vaccine? Is that the first, and then you boost with one of the others? I mean, there are lots of things which could take place based on the fact that it's a very different vaccine. The body's response will be different. We don't know what the T cell responses look like in all of this. So there's a number of things that need to be looked at in order to evaluate that difference. Thank you for letting me.
Oh,
great point.
We're honored to have you. Not only a former CDER official, but CDRH, and so great to have you.
Thank you.
Be with us.
No, this has been wonderful, really wonderful.
And Susan, you bring up as well, implying that the durability of effect is also something that we don't understand and won't until a bit of time passes. As our friend Yogi Berra said, if it wasn't for time, everything had happened all at once.
And we have an issue of, as has already been identified, there's an issue of availability. There's an issue of stability. There's an issue of shipping. This vaccine, despite the fact that it appears to have a lower efficacy over a single shot, may be just the answer we need to move quickly to broader immunity. And then we can worry about making it all perfect.
Yeah, great point. And it's not just the US. We've got to get the rest of the world vaccinated as well. And that's an even bigger challenge.
The other thing about J&J is they've already started a study with 2 shots. So they will eventually know whether a second shot, knocks them up into the same region or whether it stays at 66.
And the
Just going to add that another level of complexity is one of social responsibility, and that is, should a company with a vaccine with lower efficacy be asked to use their manufacturing capacity to produce a vaccine with higher efficacy?
Maybe Defense Production Act kind of questions for the administration.
Yeah, well, COVID has certainly changed our perspective. Doing shots with your friends was very different in college versus now.
Well, it's great to see so many friends and colleagues who've tuned in. I see Dr. Fayez Zanad, distinguished cardiologist in France, who has led the Cardiovascular Clinical Trialists Conference, which is one of the most outstanding conferences I've witnessed, and so pleased to have you, Fayez. And many other former FDA colleagues. Great to see you, and hope we'll see you in person soon.
What do you think, Zan? Have we done enough damage? We're 2 minutes before the 1 o'clock hour. And I, for one, learned an enormous amount. It was a lot of fun, as it was in prior years. I knew that this would be great, and this is fabulous. Just as a reminder for folks who are still with us, we will have a recording of this available within a couple of days. Every registrant will get links to the recording itself. And we are planning on transcribing it, but that'll take a week or two because we have to proof everything. Zan, any last words? Maybe we can then adjourn.
Well, nothing more to say except thank you to all who participated. It was just terrific. I can't wait for next year.